October 27, 1943. The sky over Kahili Airfield, Bougainville, was a flawless, hard blue. On the ground, the heat shimmered, making the parked rows of Mitsubishi A6M Zero fighters appear to waver like mirages. Loud. For Petty Officer First Class Kenji Okabe, it was just another standby alert. He lounged in the shade of his fighter's wing. The fabric of his flight suit soaked with sweat, not from nerves, but from the oppressive South Pacific humidity. Around him, the airstrip buzzed with a routine kind of tension. Mechanics tinkered, voices called out, and the ever-present smell of hot oil, gasoline, and damp earth hung in the air. Okabe was a veteran of 2 years of war, his logbook filled with sorties over China, the Philippines, and these damned Solomon Islands. He'd seen his share of combat faced American Grumman Wildcats, and even the newer, angrier-looking Corsairs. He'd earned the quiet respect of his squadron. The Zero had been his faithful companion through it all, an extension of his own will. Its lightness, its responsiveness, its ability to turn inside any American machine, these were truths as solid as the ground beneath him. It was a samurai's sword in the sky. He glanced at his watch, then up at the vacant sky. A routine patrol would be returning soon. His mind was not on the enemy, but on the letter from his sister in Hiroshima. Tucked in his breast pocket, describing the colors of the autumn leaves in Miyajima. The tranquility was severed by a sound. It wasn't the familiar, sputtering growl of radial engines, nor the high-pitched whine of diving wildcats. This was different, a strange, muffled, almost whispery roar, like 2 distant waterfalls. It came from high above, from the sun itself. Okabe and the other pilots scrambled to their feet, hands shielding their eyes, peering into the blinding zenith. At first, they saw nothing, just the blue void. Then, contrails. Not the messy, spreading smears of bombers, but thin, sharp, white lines slashing across the stratosphere with impossible speed, moving from one horizon to another in moments. They were so high they seemed to belong to a different world entirely. A radio crackled to life in the operations shack, the voice of the returning patrol leader, strained and static, laced. J-Key sent a key. High-altitude fighters, unidentified, above 30,000 Shiku! They are too fast! Okabe stared, a cold knot forming in his stomach despite the heat. The contrails curved, not with the broad arc of a searching aircraft, but with a brutal, predatory grace. Then the dots appeared, silhouettes backlit by the sun, falling like hawks. They grew with terrifying speed, resolving not into the compact, tubby shapes he knew, but into something alien, predatory, and asymmetrical twin tails, a central nacelle out. Wings that looked too straight, too business-like. They made no sound of their approach until they were already upon them. The strange whisper, roar becoming a physical tremor in the air. They were not attacking the airfield. They were demonstrating. In a blur of silver and dark green, they shot past at nearly 500 miles per hour. So fast the parked Zeros seemed to be standing still. The blast of their wake rocked the lighter fighters on their wheels, fallout rattling canopies, and sending dust devils spinning across the field. And then, as if contemptuous of gravity itself, they pulled their noses up and began to climb, not in a struggling, screaming ascent, but in a smooth, relentless accelerating zoom that took them back into the deep blue. The white contrails blooming again behind them as they reclaimed their throne in the stratosphere. In less than a minute, they were gone, vanished into the sun from whence they came. The silence they left behind was deafening. Okabe realized he had stopped breathing. He looked at his hands. They were trembling. Not from fear of an attack that never came, but from the profound instinctual understanding that the rules had just been rewritten. The Americans hadn't just built a new fighter. They had built a predator that operated in a realm the Zero could not even reach, at speeds it could not comprehend. The sky, which had been the Zero's domain, now had a master. And for the first time, standing on that sweltering airstrip, Kenji Okabe, veteran of 50 combat missions, felt a chill of utter helplessness. The sword he had wielded with such skill now felt like a toothpick against a longbow. The shockwave from that single disdainful flyover would travel faster than any bullet, through the ranks of the waiting pilots, through the command huts, through the entire Imperial Japanese Naval Air Force. It was the physical manifestation of a question that would soon become a terrifying mantra in cockpit headsets across the Pacific. Fallout. What do you do when you cannot even see the devil that hunts you? The story of this moment of terror cannot be understood without first appreciating the absolute zenith from which it fell. For Kenji Okabe and every Japanese naval aviator, the Mitsubishi A6M Zero was not merely an aircraft, it was a cultural icon, a physical manifestation of Yamato, Damashi, the Japanese spirit. Its very design was a philosophical statement, where American and European engineers added armor, self-sealing fuel tanks, and heavy weaponry. The brilliant designer Jiro Horikoshi and his team pursued a doctrine of radical minimalism. Every ounce was shaved, every component paired to its essential function. The result was a fighter that seemed to defy physics. With a weight less than 2 tons fully loaded, it could climb at over 3,000 feet per minute, dance through turns with a radius so tight it appeared to pivot on a wingtip, and range over 600 miles on its internal fuel, a distance that allowed it to strike far beyond where its enemies believed it could operate. At the war's dawn, this philosophy met an enemy unprepared for its elegance and ruthlessness. Over Pearl Harbor, the Philippines, and the Dutch East Indies, the Zero swept the skies clean. Allied pilots, trained in rigid, energy-conserving tactics, found themselves ensnared in a deadly ballet for which they had no choreography. To dogfight a Zero was to die. The American Brewster Buffalo was butchered. The Curtiss P-40 Warhawk, though sturdy, was outmaneuvered. The British Hurricane was made obsolete. The early F-4F Wildcat survived only through rugged construction and the emergence of the THAC weave, a desperate defensive tactic that was an admission of inferiority in individual combat. The Zero's pilots, men like the legendary Saburo Sakai, Tetsuzo Owamoto, and Hiroyoshi Nishizawa, were not just trained, they were sculpted. They entered the war with often over 800 hours of flight time, honed over the battlefields of China. They were masters of their machine, believing in a symbiotic relationship between man and aircraft where spirit could overcome material disadvantage. Their confidence was not arrogance, it was built upon an unbroken string of victories. They had seen their enemy break, turn away, and fall. The psychological dominance was total. An Allied pilot seeing a Zero formation felt a knot of dread. A Japanese pilot seeing Allied aircraft saw only targets. This was the atmosphere, the unquestioned reality, into which the first, confused rumors of a new American fighter began to seep in mid-1942. Whispers came from intelligence officers, gleaned from shattered radio intercepts, or the accounts of few observers in remote outposts. They spoke of a twin-engine fighter, a fork-tailed devil. The reports were met in pilot-ready rooms with incredulity and derision. A twin-engine fighter. It was a contradiction in terms! Such an aircraft would be heavy, clumsy, a lumbering whale next to the Zero's swift shark. It could never turn. It would be blind to its rear. It was a bomber interceptor, not a dogfighter. Out. The very concept offended the Japanese understanding of aerial combat as a contest of agility and nerve. The dismissive nickname was born. 2 planes, 1 pilot, a joke about its strange silhouette. The cultural and doctrinal blinders were firmly in place. Japanese aviation doctrine, like its naval strategy, was built around the concept of the decisive battle, a single, glorious clash where superior skill and fighting spirit would carry the day. Their technology reflected this. The Zero was the ultimate dueling weapon. The idea of an enemy investing not in a better dueling sword, but in an entirely different weapon system, one that might refuse to duel at all, was alien, almost dishonorable. It was a failure of imagination that would prove catastrophic. Because, while the Japanese pilots were polishing their dueling skills, a man in Burbank, California, was building a machine that would make those skills irrelevant. His name was Clarence Kelly Johnson, and his creation, the Lockheed P-38 Lightning, was engineered not for the warrior's code, but for the cold, hard calculus of physics and industrial warfare. It was born from a 1937 U.S. Army specification that sounded like a fantasy, a long-range, high-altitude interceptor capable of 400 MIF and carrying heavy armament. Johnson's answer was radical. Twin Allison V-1710 engines, each supercharged by a General Electric turbocharger nestled in the tail boom. A central nacelle for the pilot and a devastating concentration of 4 50 caliber machine guns and a 20mm cannon. And that iconic twin boom design that solved structural and aerodynamic challenges with brutal efficiency. Where the Zero was light and minimalist, the P-38 was complex and robust. It was over 3 times heavier. It carried armor plate behind the pilot, self-sealing fuel tanks, and redundant systems. It was not designed to turn with an enemy. It was designed to climb above them, dive upon them with the weight of a falling anvil, and blow them apart with a focused torrent of fire from its nose, mounted guns that required no complex convergence setting. It was, in essence, a high-altitude energy weapon. The first P-38s that arrived in the Pacific in early 1942 were plagued with teething troubles, engine cooling issues, compressibility problems in dives. To Japanese intelligence, these early reports only confirmed their prejudice. The strange twin-engine fighter was a flawed, problematic machine. They failed to see the process behind it. The relentless American system of identifying faults, engineering solutions, and iterating improvements. They saw a stumble and mistook it for a fall. They did not see the lightning gathering its strength, waiting for the moment to strike. That moment began to take shape on the fetid, blood-soaked island of Guadalcanal in late 1942. As the Marines clung to Henderson Field, the first P-38s of the 339th Fighter Squadron arrived. Their initial encounters were sporadic but telling. On November 18, 1942, Lightnings climbing to intercept a Japanese raid achieved a combat first. A stunned Japanese pilot, escaping the encounter, reported back to his base at Rabaul words that were a tiny crack in the foundation of Zero mythology. Twin engines, twin tails, climbing like nothing we have seen. The crack was there. The earthquake was coming. And men like Kenji Okabe, still confident in their undefeated sword, were about to learn that their war was over, and a new, more terrifying one had begun. The crucible for this new war was the sprawling, chaotic, and vicious air campaign over the Solomon Islands. Here, the theoretical met the visceral. The P-38, initially a curious rarity, began to appear with ominous frequency in the high blue over the slot, the channel down which Japanese reinforcements ran the gauntlet to Guadalcanal. The American pilots, many transitioning from the outclassed P-39 Airacobra or the sturdy P-40 out, were themselves on a steep learning curve. They had the hammer, now they had to learn how to wield it. Their first lesson, beaten into them by bitter experience against Zeros, was an unbreakable commandment. Thou shalt not turn out. To engage a Zero in a horizontal turning fight was to volunteer for an obituary. The Lightning's great weight, which made it stable in a dive, made it a sluggish whale in a low-speed contest. But veterans like Lieutenant Richard Bong and Captain Thomas Lynch, though not yet aces began to intuit the Lightning's true language. It was a language of verticality, of potential and kinetic energy. They learned to patrol at 25,000, 30,000 feet altitudes where the thin air sapped the Zero's already anemic supercharged engine of its power, where its controls turned mushy, and where its pilots, shivering in unheated cockpits, struggled to think out. From this throne room, they would watch the distant specks of Japanese formations below, like hawks observing mice in a field. The tactical innovation was born not in a manual, but in the desperate clarity of combat. They called it boom and zoom. A flight leader would radio, "Okay, let's go to work." Noses would tip over. The Lightnings, leveraging their mass, would transform altitude into velocity, accelerating in a silent, screaming dive that pushed them past 450, 500 miles per hour. The strange, muffled roar of their engines was often unheard by the targets below until it was too late. The Zero's vaunted maneuverability became its coffin. At such high speeds, its ailerons stiffened its control cables stretched, and it became a stable, predictable platform for the P-38's gunsight. The Lightning pilots would streak through the formation, the world a blur their concentration funneled to the pipper on the canopy glass. A short, rattling burst from the nose. Mounted battery. No need for complex deflection shooting. The guns converged at a point, and then the most critical part, the zoom Instead of pulling into a turn to re-engage, they would use their tremendous remaining speed to pull back on the yoke. Climbing steeply, gravity now their enemy as they converted speed back into altitude, leaving any outraged and outclimbed Zeros flailing helplessly in their wake. Back at altitude, they would circle, assess, and set up for another pass. It was less a dogfight and more a series of slashing, high-speed cavalry charges. The psychological impact on the Japanese was immediate and profound. For the first time they were being attacked from a domain they could not reach. A Zero pilot's eyes, trained to scan the horizon, and his tail, now had to perpetually search the empty, blinding zenith. The anxiety was corrosive. Lieutenant Junichi Sasai, a renowned ace and leader of the famed Tainan Air Group, confided in his diary a new kind of fear. The worry is constant. You are watching the bombers, watching your wingmen, watching your fuel, and you must also watch the sky above for the silent ones. It splits your mind. You cannot be a hunter when you are also prey. The physical losses, while mounting, were something the Imperial Navy could, on paper, absorb. The psychological demolition of their core tactical faith was not. The very essence of the Zero, its tight turn, its ability to get inside an enemy's OODA loop, was rendered null. Out. You cannot get inside the decision cycle of an enemy who strikes from a perpendicular plane of existence, and then vanishes before a counter can even be conceived. Out. The Americans were not fighting them, they were systematically dismantling them. And then came April 18th, 1943, a date that burned the P-38's supremacy, not just into Japanese tactical logs, but into their national psyche. U.S. Navy intelligence, having broken Japanese codes, learned that the architect of Pearl Harbor, Fleet Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, would be flying an inspection tour to Bougainville. The order came down from the highest levels. Get him. The mission was handed to the P-38, the only Allied fighter in the theater with the range to intercept him 435 miles over open ocean. It was an audacious, seemingly impossible task, a precise aerial ambush requiring navigation so exact it bordered on witchcraft. Major John W. Mitchell led 16 Lightnings on a nerve-shredding wave, top flight to avoid detection. Out. A feat of dead, reckoning navigation over featureless ocean. Out. They arrived at the interception point, not just on the correct day, but within 1 minute of Yamamoto's flight. It was a staggering demonstration of planning, discipline, and technical capability. When the two Japanese G4M, Betty, bombers and their 6-0 escorts appeared, the trap was sprung. The kill flight, led by Captain Thomas Lanphier, pounced. In the ensuing chaos, Yamamoto's bomber was sent crashing into the jungle. The admiral was dead. The Zero escorts, flying a low-altitude cover, were utterly outmaneuvered by the diving, zooming Lightnings. One was shot down, the others were left stunned and ineffective. Out. The message of Operation Vengeance was not subtle. It screamed across the Pacific. We can see your most secret movements. We can fly across impossible distances. We can pluck your most revered leader from the sky, out, from under the nose of his best defenders, and we will do it with the very machine you dismissed as a joke. For the Japanese pilot corps, it was a spiritual evisceration. The death of Yamamoto, a figure of near divine stature, out, was bad enough. The manner of his death, the clinical, technological precision of it, was a trauma from which their morale never recovered. If the P-38 could do this, what was safe? Out. The sky was no longer a sanctuary, it was a shooting gallery, and they were the ducks. Back at Kahili and Rabaul, the jokes about 2 planes, 1 pilot, died a sudden death. A new, more respectful, and far more fearful nickname took its place, the Fork-tailed Devil. And in ready rooms, veterans like Kenji Okabe now looked at the clear blue sky not with confidence, but with a deep, unsettling dread. The devil was real, and it was hunting on its own terms. The demonstrable superiority of the P-38 in the skies was merely the tip of a massive, industrialized iceberg. What Japanese pilots experienced as a terrifying new physical reality was, in fact, the leading edge of a systemic clash between 2 fundamentally different modes of warfare. To understand the depth of their shock, one must look past the airframes and into the factories, the training fields, and the very economic sinews of the nations that built them. The Zero and the Lightning were not just different aircraft. They were symbols of their creators' souls. Japan's war industry was one of exquisite craftsmanship hamstrung by scarcity. The Zero was a masterpiece of optimization within severe constraints. Its lightweight aluminum alloy, extra super duralumin was a marvel of metallurgy, but it was brittle and in chronically short supply. Its Nakajima Sake radial engine was reliable and relatively powerful for its weight. But it was a naturally aspirated engine. It breathed the thin air of high altitude poorly, its power dropping off like a stone above 18,000 feet, most damningly to achieve its supernatural agility. Horikoshi's team had made Faustian bargains. Early models completely omitted pilot armor, self-sealing fuel tanks, and even radios in some cases. The pilot was the aircraft's soul, but he was also its most vulnerable component. Sitting in a flying gas tank, this was a philosophy born of material poverty and cultural belief. The machine was an expression of the pilot's will, and the will, it was believed, could triumph over matter. Every Zero was, in a sense, hand-finished. Production was dispersed among several arsenals and workshops, with variances between individual aircraft. This artisan approach could not scale to meet the voracious appetite of a war of attrition. America's Lockheed plant in Burbank, by contrast, was a temple to a new religion: mass production, standardization, and continuous improvement. The P-38 was a complex beast with over 300,000 parts. Yet, through techniques pioneered by the automotive industry, assembly lines, jigs, and sub-assembly stations, these parts came together with machine-like regularity. A new Lightning rolled out the door nearly every day. The numbers are staggering. By war's end, Lockheed and its subcontractors would build over 10,000 P-38s in 18 distinct major variants, each variant from the early P-38E to the definitive P-380L was not just a batch of new planes, it was a product of relentless feedback from the front. Compressibility problems in dives. Engineers added dive flaps. Cockpits too cold. They installed better heating. Ailerons too heavy at high speed. They introduced hydraulic boost. The P-38 was not a static design. It was a living project. Evolving in real time to outpace its enemies, this extended to its heart. The Allison engine with its General Electric turbo supercharger. This combination was America's secret weapon. The turbocharger used exhaust gases to force dense air into the engine, allowing it to maintain full military power at altitudes where the Zero was gasping. It was a piece of high-temperature, precision machinery that Japan simply could not produce in quantity or quality. The Allison engine itself was a product of a limitless resource base: high-octane aviation fuel. American engines were designed to run on 100-octane fuel, then 115, then 150. This firewater allowed for higher compression ratios and more aggressive boost settings, squeezing out hundreds of extra horsepower. Japan, starved of oil, struggled to produce consistent 92-octane fuel. Their engines were literally drinking inferior nourishment. This industrial divergence created a terrifying arithmetic for the Japanese pilot. He was flying a 1940 design, largely unchanged, against an enemy whose weapon was improving every month. The P-38J he faced in late 1943 was significantly better than the P-38F that had appeared a year before. The P-38L of 1944 was a different animal entirely. Meanwhile, his A6M Model 32, HAMP, or even the later A615 Model 52 were essentially refined versions of the same 1937 concept. The gap wasn't static, it was a widening chasm. But the most profound, and ultimately most devastating, disparity was not in the machines, but in the men who flew them. Japan began the war with a small corps of elite, superbly trained pilots, the Chutai of veterans who had honed their skills in China. These men were irreplaceable. In the grinding meat, grinder of the Solomons, these aces began to fall. Sasai was killed in August 1942 over Guadalcanal. Nishizawa, the Devil of Rabal, would die in 1944. Saburo Sakai was severely wounded and sidelined for a year. With every veteran lost, the collective skill and wisdom of the Japanese air arm bled away. Their training pipeline, never robust, was now catastrophic. Facing fuel shortages, a lack of advanced trainers, and a desperate need for warm bodies, the Imperial Navy slashed training programs. Pre-war pilots had 800 hours. By 1943, new recruits were sent to front-line units with 300. By 1944, it was 150. By 1945, lout. Boys were being thrown into cockpits of operational Zeros with 50 hours total flight time, barely able to take off and land out. Let alone dogfight. They were given a cursory lesson in formation flying, a few dry fire gunnery passes, and a pep talk about serving the Emperor. They were not pilots, they were cannon fodder with wings out. The American system operated in reverse. The pilot was seen as a valuable, expensively trained system component. The civilian pilot training program, and later the aviation cadet program, created a vast pool of talent. A newly minted USAAF pilot in 1943 arrived at his operational training unit with over 200 hours. There, lout, he would train specifically on the aircraft he would fly in combat, learning its systems, practicing gunnery with camera guns, and drilling tactical formations like the fluid. Finger 4. By the time he joined a squadron in the Pacific, he had 600 hours of thorough, systematic training. He was a professional. The contrast in the sky was pitiful and lethal. A young, terrified Japanese seaman first class, trembling in his cockpit, trying to remember his emergency procedures, lout, would be bounced by a confident American lieutenant with the flying hours of an airline pilot, out. Supported by a wingman he'd trained with for months, both of them executing a practiced, high, side pass they'd rehearsed 100 times. The outcome was not a battle, it was an execution. This was the full, horrifying truth that dawned on veterans like Okabe. The fork-tailed devil was not an anomaly, it was the harbinger. It represented an enemy who fought not just with better machines, but with an overwhelming, self-replenishing system of industry, logistics, innovation, and human capital. Japan had bet its empire on a duel of samurai. America had shown up with the impersonal, grinding machinery of a modern industrial state, and in that kind of war, spirit, no matter how fierce, was just another resource to be spent, and spent down to nothing out. The psychological corrosion initiated by the P-38's performance and America's industrial might metastasized into a full-blown crisis of confidence that seeped into every aspect of Japanese aerial operations. Loud. This was not merely a fear of a faster plane. It was the collapse of an entire worldview. Out. A spiritual unraveling that turned the cockpit from a seat of a warrior into a coffin waiting to be sealed. The first and most palpable symptom was the death of aggression. The Zero pilot's doctrine had been built on the offensive. Seek, close, and destroy. Now, the order of the day became evasion and survival. Veteran commanders, seeing their inexperienced charges slaughtered out, began issuing tactical instructions that would have been unthinkable 2 years prior. Pilots were told to avoid combat with the twin-tailed fighters, unless they held an overwhelming numerical or positional advantage. They were instructed to use cloud cover not for ambush, but for concealment, to break off and dive away at the first sign of a high-speed pass. The warrior ethos of Kessen, the decisive battle, was being replaced by a grim calculus of attrition. They knew they were losing out. The psychological weight of this defensive posture was crushing. Flying a patrol became an exercise